7 wolves surrounded Tempest and her 3 foals in a Montana meadow, their hungry eyes locked on the vulnerable babies she had sworn to protect. By sunset, 5 of those predators would lie dead in the blood-soaked grass, killed by a mother who refused to let anything take her children. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go! The mountains of Montana held secrets that only the wind could whisper, and on that fateful autumn morning, the valleys below seemed to breathe with a tension that even the oldest ranchers could feel in their bones. The air carried the scent of pine and the promise of an early frost, while shadows stretched long across the meadows, where the wild horses roamed free. Among those horses, there was one who stood apart from the rest, a mare so magnificent that those who saw her often stopped in their tracks just to admire her presence. Her name was Tempest, and she was unlike any horse the region had ever known. Tempest was a draft horse of extraordinary size, her coat a rich chestnut that gleamed like burnished copper in the sunlight. She stood nearly 18 hands tall, towering over most horses in the valley, with a muscular frame that spoke of both power and grace. Her mane, a flowing cascade of cream and gold, caught the light like threads of silk dancing in the breeze. But what truly set Tempest apart was not her size or her beauty. It was the fierce intelligence that burned in her dark eyes, a fire that seemed to understand the world in ways that defied explanation. 3 months earlier, Tempest had given birth to twin foals, a rare occurrence that had drawn the attention of wildlife observers and ranchers alike. The twins, a male named Storm and a female named Ember, were mirror images of their mother's magnificence. Storm possessed the same chestnut coloring, while Ember displayed a lighter, golden hue that made her appear as though she had been touched by the morning sun itself. A third foal, a young colt named Thunder, had been born just 6 weeks prior, making Tempest the guardian of 3 vulnerable lives in a land where danger lurked behind every shadow. The valley where Tempest and her foals grazed was a place of raw beauty, where the Rocky Mountains rose like ancient sentinels against the endless sky. The grass was tall and green despite the approaching season, nourished by the streams that trickled down from the snow-capped peaks above. It was a paradise for the wild horses, a sanctuary where they could run free without the constraints of fences or the demands of human masters. But paradise, as nature often reminds us, comes with its own price. For in those same mountains, hidden among the shadows of the forest, a pack of wolves had been watching. The pack was led by a gray wolf known to the local rangers as Ghost, a name earned through his uncanny ability to move without sound and strike without warning. Ghost was old by wolf standards, his muzzle tinged with white, but age had only sharpened his cunning. He had led his pack through harsh winters and scarce summers, teaching them the art of patience and the science of the hunt. For weeks, Ghost had been observing the valley, studying the movements of the wild horses, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now, with 3 young foals grazing beside their mother, that moment had finally arrived. On the morning that would change everything, Tempest led her foals to their favorite grazing spot near the edge of the meadow. The sun had barely risen above the mountains, casting the world in shades of gold and amber. Storm and Ember played nearby, their long legs still unsteady as they chased each other through the grass. Thunder, the youngest, stayed close to his mother's side, his eyes wide with wonder as he explored the world around him. Tempest watched them with the vigilance of a guardian who understood that in the wild, peace was merely the quiet before the storm. She could feel something in the air that morning, a wrongness that made her ears twitch, and her nostrils flare. The birds had fallen silent in the trees, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted, as though nature itself was holding its breath. Tempest raised her massive head, scanning the tree line with eyes that had seen countless dangers and survived them all. She saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the familiar outlines of pine and fir stretching toward the sky. But her instincts, honed through generations of survival, told her that something was watching. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the forest, Ghost had gathered his pack. There were 7 wolves in total, each one a skilled hunter hardened by the unforgiving wilderness. They moved through the underbrush like phantoms, their eyes fixed on the meadow where the foals played with innocent abandon. Ghost had studied the mare carefully, noting her size and strength with calculating respect. She was larger than any horse he had ever hunted, a formidable adversary that could crush a wolf's skull with a single kick. But her foals were vulnerable. And in the natural order of things, vulnerability was an invitation. The wolves spread out in a wide arc, using the cover of the trees to approach from multiple directions. It was a tactic Ghost had perfected over years of hunting, a strategy designed to confuse and overwhelm even the most alert prey. 2 wolves approached from the north, their gray and brown coats blending with the autumn foliage. 3 more circled to the south, moving with the silent precision of seasoned predators. Ghost himself took position to the east, directly in front of where Tempest stood guard, his amber eyes never leaving the foals that represented an easy meal for his hungry pack. Tempest sensed the movement before she saw it. A flutter in the grass, a shadow that shifted when it should have been still. Her muscles tensed beneath her gleaming coat, and she let out a low warning to her foals, a sound that Storm, Ember, and Thunder understood immediately. They stopped their play and gathered close to their mother, their young bodies pressing against her massive legs as fear began to replace their earlier joy. Tempest positioned herself between her foals and the forest, her hooves planted firmly on the ground, her eyes scanning for the threat she knew was coming. Then she saw them. One by one, the wolves emerged from the shadows, their forms materializing like nightmares given flesh. They surrounded the mare and her foals in a semicircle, their yellow eyes gleaming with hunger, their lips pulled back to reveal teeth that had torn through countless victims. Ghost stepped forward, his gaze locked with Tempest's in a silent declaration of intent. He had brought death to this meadow, and he expected to leave with a full belly. But Ghost had made a fatal miscalculation. He had seen Tempest's size and assumed she would flee like other horses he had hunted. He had not counted on the fire that burned in her heart, the primal fury of a mother who would die before letting any harm come to her children. What happened next would become legend in those mountains, a story that would be told for generations. The silence that fell upon the meadow was deafening, a void where sound should have been, but was not. The wolves had expected the mare to panic, to gather her foals and attempt to flee as countless prey animals had done before her. They had counted on her fear to drive her into the waiting jaws of the pack of members who had positioned themselves along every escape route. But Tempest did not run. She did not even take a single step backward. Instead, she lowered her massive head and released a sound that none of the wolves had ever heard from a horse before. A deep, rumbling challenge that seemed to shake the very earth beneath their paws. Ghost hesitated for the first time in his long career as a hunter. The sound that came from the mare was not the frightened whinny of prey. It was the battle cry of a warrior, a declaration that she would not surrender her children without a fight. The alpha wolf's ears flattened against his skull as he processed this unexpected development. Behind him, the younger wolves shifted nervously. their confidence wavering in the face of an adversary who refused to follow the script that nature had written. Tempest's eyes never left the wolves as she positioned her foals directly behind her massive body. Storm and Ember pressed close together, their trembling forms barely visible beneath their mother's protective shadow. Thunder, the youngest and most vulnerable, stood between his siblings, his small heart pounding with a terror he could not comprehend. They could feel their mother's tension, the coiled power in her muscles that promised violence to any who dared approach. And though they were afraid, that fear was tempered by an instinctive trust in the mare who had given them life. The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity, predator and protector measuring each other across the morning grass. Ghost was a patient hunter, and he understood that the first to move often became the first to fall. He waited for the mare to show weakness, a momentary distraction, a shift in her stance that would create an opening for his pack. But Tempest was carved from different stone than the horses Ghost had hunted before. She had not survived this long in the wild by making careless mistakes, and she would not start now. It was one of the younger wolves who broke first. Emboldened by hunger and inexperience, a brown wolf to the south made a darting move toward the foals. The attack was meant to test the mare's defenses, a probing strike designed to gauge her reaction speed. But the young wolf had grievously underestimated what he was facing. Before he had covered half the distance to the foals, Tempest was in motion, her massive body spinning with a speed that seemed impossible for a creature of her size. Her hind legs launched backward with the force of twin battering rams, catching the young wolf squarely in the chest. The impact was catastrophic. The crack of breaking ribs echoed across the meadow as the wolf was lifted off the ground and sent tumbling through the air. He landed nearly 15 feet away, a broken heap of fur and shattered bone, his last breath escaping in a rattling wheeze. The other wolves froze in shock as they watched their packmate die, their eyes wide with a fear they had rarely experienced as hunters. Tempest returned to her defensive position before the body had even stopped moving, her nostrils flaring as she surveyed the remaining wolves. Her message was clear and unmistakable. She was not prey to be hunted. She was death, waiting to be dealt to any who threatened her children. The wolves circled nervously now, their earlier confidence replaced by a healthy respect for the mare, who had just killed one of their own with a single blow. But Ghost was not deterred. The old alpha had seen too much death to be intimidated by one loss, no matter how dramatic. He knew that the mare could not defend against attacks from all directions simultaneously. Her size, which made her so dangerous in direct confrontation, also made her slow to turn. If his pack attacked from multiple angles at once, they could reach the foals while she was dealing with threats elsewhere. It was a risky strategy that would likely cost more wolf lives, but Ghost was willing to pay that price. In the harsh calculus of survival, the meal was worth the sacrifice. With a low growl, Ghost communicated his intentions to the pack. The wolves spread further apart, creating maximum distance between themselves to force the mare to choose which direction to defend. Tempest watched them move, her intelligent eyes tracking each wolf as they repositioned. She understood what they were doing. She had seen pack hunters employ similar tactics against other prey. But understanding the strategy did not mean she could easily counter it. Her foals could only hide behind her from one direction at a time, and the wolves were making certain there would be no safe direction. The attack came without warning. 2 wolves rushed from the east, while another charged from the west. A 4th wolf came from the north, completing a 3-pronged assault designed to overwhelm the mare's defenses. Tempest reared up on her hind legs, her front hooves slashing through the air as she faced the eastern attackers. Her height in that moment was truly terrifying, a tower of muscle and fury that blocked out the rising sun. The wolves from the east scattered before her hooves could find their mark, dancing back just out of reach. But the attack from the west found its opening. A gray wolf managed to slip past the mare's flank, its jaws snapping at Thunder's hindquarters. The young foal screamed in terror as teeth grazed his flesh, drawing first blood in this desperate battle. Tempest's reaction was immediate and savage. She brought her front hooves crashing down and pivoted with impossible speed, her rear legs already launching into another devastating kick. The gray wolf tried to retreat, but it was a fraction of a second too slow. One massive hoof caught it across the shoulder, sending it spinning into the grass with a yelp of pain. Storm and Ember had moved to shield their younger brother, their small bodies forming a protective barrier around Thunder's trembling form. Blood seeped from the scratch on Thunder's flank, a minor wound that could have been so much worse. Tempest positioned herself over all three foals now, her legs spread wide to create a living shield of flesh and bone. She was breathing hard, her chest heaving from the exertion, but her eyes burned with an undiminished fire. 2 wolves were down, 1 dead and 1 injured, but 5 still remained. And among them was Ghost, who had not yet committed to the attack. The Alpha was waiting, watching, learning the mare's patterns so he could exploit them when the moment was right. The sun had fully risen now, casting the meadow in brilliant light that seemed to mock the violence unfolding within it. Somewhere in the distance, birds had begun to sing again, oblivious to the life and death struggle playing out below. Tempest stood her ground, her foals huddled beneath her, her body ready to deliver death to any wolf foolish enough to approach. But she knew that this was only the beginning. The wolves were hungry, and hungry predators did not abandon their prey easily. The battle for her children's lives had only just begun. Ghost circled the perimeter of the confrontation like a general surveying a battlefield, his amber eyes cataloging every detail of the mare's defensive stance. He had underestimated her twice now, a mistake that had cost him 2 wolves and would not be repeated. The old Alpha understood that brute force alone would not bring down this enemy. She was too large, too powerful, and far too determined to protect her young. Victory would require cunning, patience, and the willingness to sacrifice more of his pack to exhaust her strength. Ghost was prepared to do whatever was necessary. In the wild, mercy was a luxury that predators could not afford. The injured wolf had dragged itself to the edge of the clearing, whimpering softly as it nursed its shattered shoulder. It would never hunt again, and both it and Ghost knew that such an injury was essentially a death sentence in the unforgiving wilderness. But the Alpha spared no sympathy for the fallen. His attention remained fixed on the prize that still stood defiant in the center of the meadow. 3 foals represented enough meat to feed his pack for days, and that prize was worth any cost. Tempest could feel her muscles beginning to burn from the sustained tension. Every fiber of her being was coiled and ready for the next attack, a state of alertness that demanded enormous reserves of energy. She had not eaten since the previous evening, and the exertion of combat was draining her faster than she had anticipated. Beneath her protective stance, her foals huddled in terrified silence, their young minds unable to comprehend why these gray creatures wanted to hurt them. Storm pressed his body against Ember, who in turn sheltered Thunder between them. Even in their fear, the instinct to protect each other manifested in these small acts of solidarity. The wolves had regrouped now, forming a tighter formation under Ghost's silent direction. 4 able-bodied hunters remained, plus the Alpha himself. They moved with a coordination that spoke of countless hunts, each wolf knowing its role without the need for verbal communication. Ghost positioned himself directly in front of Tempest, holding her attention while the others spread out to flank her. This time, there would be no premature charges, no wasted attacks. They would strike together, overwhelming her defenses through sheer numbers and synchronized assault. Tempest watched them reposition with growing dread. She could feel the strategy tightening around her like a noose, the mathematical certainty that she could not be everywhere at once pressing against her consciousness. Her foals were her weakness, the anchor that prevented her from maneuvering freely. If she had been alone, she might have charged through the wolves' formation and galloped to safety. But she was not alone, and running meant abandoning her children to certain death. That was something she would never do, not while breath remained in her body and strength in her legs. The second coordinated attack came without warning. All 5 wolves rushed forward simultaneously, converging on the mare and her foals from every direction. Tempest reared again, her front hooves striking out at the wolves approaching from the front. One of them yelped as a hoof grazed its skull, opening a gash that sent blood streaming into its eyes. But the others pressed forward, using the distraction to close the distance. Teeth snapped at Tempest's flanks, at her legs, at any exposed flesh that presented itself. She felt the sharp sting of a bite on her rear leg and lashed out blindly, her kick finding empty air as the attacker danced away. Storm screamed as a wolf lunged toward him, its jaws wide and hungry. Without thinking, the young foal struck out with his own small hooves, a pathetic defense against a predator that outweighed him significantly. But the gesture bought precious seconds, enough time for Tempest to spin and deliver a thunderous kick that caught the attacking wolf in the ribs. The wolf crumpled with a howl of agony, rolling across the grass as it struggled to draw breath through punctured lungs. 3 wolves down now, but the price of this victory was written in the blood that ran down Tempest's wounded leg. Ghost observed the carnage with cold calculation. The mare was magnificent, he had to admit. She had killed or incapacitated 3 of his wolves, a toll that would have sent most packs fleeing in defeat. But Ghost noticed something that the mare could not hide. Her movements were becoming slower, her breathing more labored. The wound on her leg was deeper than it appeared, and the blood loss was beginning to affect her performance. She was tiring, and tired prey eventually made mistakes. All he had to do was keep the pressure constant until that inevitable error occurred. The remaining wolves circled again, this time keeping a more respectful distance. They had learned to fear the mare's hooves, but fear did not erase hunger. Their bellies were empty, their pack decimated, and retreat was no longer an option. If they abandoned this hunt now, they would not have the strength to pursue another for days. Ghost made his decision. He would commit to the fight personally, using his experience to create the opening his remaining wolves needed. Tempest watched the alpha approach with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. She could feel her strength fading, could feel the warm blood trickling down her leg with every heartbeat. But her foals were still alive behind her, still depending on her to keep them safe. She thought of Storm, so brave despite his fear, who had tried to fight off a wolf with hooves barely larger than the predator's paws. She thought of Ember, who had not uttered a sound since the attack began, her silence a testament to the paralyzing terror she was experiencing. She thought of Thunder, the baby, whose only crime was being born into a world where survival demanded constant vigilance and strength. For them, Tempest would fight until her last breath. For them, she would become the monster that these wolves had never expected to encounter. She lowered her head and pawed at the ground, a gesture of challenge that needed no translation. The message was clear to every creature watching. Come and try to take my children. I will make you pay for every inch of ground in blood and broken bones. Ghost accepted the challenge. With a snarl that split the morning air, the alpha wolf charged directly at the mare, his packmates following close behind. The final phase of the battle had begun, and only one side would walk away from this meadow alive. The sun continued its indifferent climb across the sky, illuminating a scene of primal violence that had played out countless times throughout history. The eternal struggle between predator and prey, between hunger and love. The collision between Ghost and Tempest was like thunder meeting lightning. A clash of primal forces that sent shock waves through the very air around them. The alpha wolf was cunning, dodging the mare's initial strike and darting beneath her guard to snap at her injured leg. His teeth found their mark, sinking into the wound that was already bleeding freely, tearing at the damaged flesh with savage efficiency. Tempest screamed in pain and fury, a sound that echoed off the distant mountains and sent birds fleeing from the surrounding trees. But even as the agony lanced through her body, she was already counterattacking, her massive head swinging down like a hammer. Her skull connected with Ghost's body just as he was attempting to retreat, the impact lifting him off his feet and sending him tumbling across the grass. The old alpha recovered quickly, rolling with the blow and regaining his footing with the practiced grace of a survivor. Blood dripped from his mouth, some of it his own from a cut inside his lip, most of it belonging to the mare. He had tasted her weakness now, had felt the warmth of her life flowing over his tongue. It was only a matter of time before that weakness became her undoing. The other wolves pressed their advantage, while Tempest was distracted by Ghost. A brown female darted in from the left, her jaws closing around the mare's front ankle with crushing force. Tempest stumbled, her weight shifting dangerously as the wolf refused to release its grip. Another wolf, a young male with a scarred muzzle, saw his opportunity and lunged toward the foals. Storm and Ember scrambled backward, their small bodies colliding with each other in their panic. Thunder stood frozen, too terrified to move, his eyes wide and glassy as death came racing toward him. What happened next would be seared into the memories of every creature who witnessed it. Tempest, despite the wolf attached to her ankle, despite the blood loss and exhaustion, launched herself into the air with a power that defied explanation. Her front hooves came down on the wolf attacking her ankle, crushing its spine with a sickening crunch that silenced its snarls forever. Without pausing, she pivoted on her remaining good leg and intercepted the wolf charging toward Thunder, her chest slamming into the predator with the force of a freight train. The scarred wolf went flying, its body cartwheeling through the air before landing in a motionless heap near the tree line. 4 wolves dead now, with only Ghost and one other remaining. The cost had been enormous. Tempest stood on 3 legs, her injured front ankle refusing to bear weight, her rear leg still bleeding from the original wound. She was a magnificent ruin, a warrior goddess brought low by accumulated damage, but still refusing to fall. Her foals huddled behind her, their small bodies trembling but unharmed, protected by a mother whose love knew no limits. Ghost assessed the situation with the cold logic that had kept him alive for so many years. His pack was destroyed, reduced from 7 hunters to 2 in the span of minutes. The mare was wounded, yes, perhaps mortally, but she was far from defeated. Every attack had cost him wolves while barely slowing her down. The calculus of survival, which had always favored the patient predator, now screamed at him to retreat and live to hunt another day. But something held him in place, some combination of hunger and wounded pride that refused to accept defeat at the hooves of prey. The last remaining wolf, a gray female who had been Ghost's mate for 3 seasons, approached him cautiously. Her eyes held a question that needed no words. Should they continue or withdraw? Ghost looked at her, then back at the mare, who stood defiant despite her injuries. He had never abandoned a hunt before. His reputation, his authority as alpha, was built on the foundation of relentless persistence. To run now would be to admit that he had been bested by a horse, a creature that nature had designed to be nothing more than food for wolves like him. Tempest watched the 2 wolves confer, using the momentary respite to check on her foals. Storm pressed against her good front leg, his young face a mask of exhaustion and residual fear. Ember had finally broken her silence, making small whimpering sounds as she nuzzled against her mother's belly. Thunder remained still, his eyes unfocused, clearly in shock from the trauma he had witnessed. The scratch on his flank had stopped bleeding, a minor injury that would heal quickly if they survived the day. Tempest bent her head and breathed warm air over each of her children, a gesture of comfort and reassurance that she was still there, still fighting. The sun had climbed higher now, approaching its midday zenith. Hours had passed since the attack began, though to Tempest it felt like an eternity compressed into a single endless moment. Her body was a symphony of pain, each wound crying out for rest and treatment that she could not provide. But the wolves were still there, still watching, still hungry. She could not afford to show weakness, could not allow herself to collapse until the threat had been eliminated or driven away. Her foals needed her strong, needed her standing, needed her ready to defend them against whatever came next. Ghost made his decision. He turned to his mate and communicated his intentions through the subtle language of posture and expression that wolves had refined over millennia. They would make one final attack, a desperate all-or-nothing assault that would either bring down the mare or end in their own destruction. There was no room for half measures now, no strategic retreats or probing strikes. This would be the conclusion, one way or another. The 2 wolves began to circle in opposite directions, their movements synchronized despite the absence of verbal coordination. Tempest tracked them both, her head swiveling between the threats as she tried to anticipate where the attack would come from. Her injured legs screamed in protest as she shifted her weight, but she forced herself to remain upright, to present the image of strength even as her body betrayed her. Her foals had retreated as far as they could go, pressing against each other in a tight cluster of fear and hope. Everything came down to this moment, this final confrontation that would determine whether they lived or died. The final charge came like a whisper of death across the meadow. Ghost attacked from the front, while his mate circled behind, their movements perfectly timed to divide the mare's attention. Tempest faced an impossible choice, one that every mother dreads in her darkest nightmares. Protect her front or protect her back. Shield her children or shield herself. In that frozen moment between heartbeats, she made her decision with the clarity that only desperate love can provide. Instead of retreating or turning to face both threats, Tempest charged directly at Ghost. The move was so unexpected, so contrary to every defensive instinct, that the alpha wolf hesitated for a fraction of a second. That hesitation was all Tempest needed. Her massive body collided with the Ghost at full speed, her chest driving into him with bone-crushing force. The impact sent both animals tumbling, a chaotic tangle of fur and hooves and snapping jaws that rolled across the blood-stained grass. Behind her, the female wolf reached the foals. Storm and Ember scattered in opposite directions, their young legs carrying them away from the predator with instinctive urgency. But Thunder remained frozen, his shock too deep to allow movement. The female wolf saw the easiest target and adjusted her trajectory, her jaws opening wide as she prepared to deliver the killing bite. Time seemed to slow as death approached the youngest foal, each second stretching into an eternity of helpless terror. Tempest heard Thunder's cry of fear, a high-pitched whinny that cut through the chaos of her own struggle. She was on the ground, Ghost's teeth locked around her neck, his weight pressing down on her chest. She could feel his fangs searching for the vital blood vessels beneath her hide, probing for the kill shot that would end her fight forever. But the sound of her baby's terror ignited something within her that transcended physical limitations, a reservoir of strength that she had not known she possessed. With a surge of desperate power, Tempest heaved herself upward, lifting Ghost's entire body off the ground as she rose. The wolf refused to release his grip, his jaws clamping tighter even as she thrashed. But Tempest was beyond pain now, beyond exhaustion, beyond anything except the primal need to save her child. She reared back on her hind legs, reaching her full towering height, and then threw herself sideways with all the force her wounded body could generate. The impact of hitting the ground stunned Ghost into releasing his grip. Tempest did not waste a single moment. She rolled to her feet and launched herself toward Thunder, her injured legs screaming in protest but carrying her forward nonetheless. The female wolf was barely a body length from the foal, close enough to taste the victory that was about to be stolen from her. She saw the mare coming and tried to abort her attack, tried to dodge the mountain of flesh and fury bearing down on her position. She was not fast enough. Tempest's hooves caught her in mid-turn, one striking her hip and the other catching her skull with devastating precision. The crack of bone was audible even above the chaos of the moment, a sound that announced the end of another wolf's life. The female crumpled to the ground, her body twitching once before falling still. She had been Ghost's mate, his hunting partner, his companion through countless seasons. Now she was nothing but cooling meat on the trampled grass. Thunder finally broke free of his paralysis, scrambling to his mother's side with desperate bleating sounds. Storm and Ember had circled back, their fear overridden by the need to be near Tempest. The three foals clustered around their mother's legs, pressing against her, as though trying to merge with her body for protection. Tempest stood over them, her legs trembling, her wounds bleeding freely, her breath coming in ragged gasps that spoke of a body pushed far beyond its limits. Ghost rose slowly from where he had fallen, his amber eyes surveying the devastation around him. His entire pack was gone, killed by a creature that should have been nothing more than a meal. His mate lay dead just yards away, her skull crushed by the hooves of the mare, who still stood defiant against all odds. The alpha wolf had lived a long life by knowing when to fight and when to flee. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to turn and run, to disappear into the forest and lick his wounds in solitude. But wolves do not become alphas by listening to fear. They become alphas by dominating that fear, by facing challenges that would send lesser creatures fleeing. Ghost had built his reputation on never backing down, on pursuing prey until he caught them or died trying. This mare had taken everything from him, his pack, his mate, his pride. If he fled now, he would be nothing but a broken old wolf waiting for death in some forgotten corner of the wilderness. Better to die here, in combat, than to slink away like a beaten dog. Tempest watched the lone wolf approach, her heart sinking as she realized he was not retreating. She had hoped, desperately hoped, that the destruction of his pack would be enough to drive him away. But the fire in his eyes told a different story. This wolf was not hunting for food anymore. He was hunting for revenge, for the satisfaction of taking something from her as she had taken everything from him. Even if he died in the attempt, he would try to kill at least one of her foals before the end. The mare gathered what remained of her strength, drawing from reserves she did not know existed. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, heavy and unresponsive. The wounds on her body had created a map of agony that extended from her neck to her hindquarters. She could barely see through the haze of pain and exhaustion that clouded her vision. But her foals were behind her, counting on her, believing in her. For them, she would fight one more time. For them, she would face this final enemy and give everything she had left. Ghost stopped just outside the range of her hooves, his tongue lolling from his mouth as he panted from his own exertions. Both combatants were exhausted, both pushed to the very edge of their endurance. What came next would be decided not by strength or speed, but by will alone. The question was simple. Which of them wanted it more? Which of them was willing to sacrifice everything for victory? The answer would be written in blood on the grass of this Montana meadow. The wind shifted direction, carrying with it the metallic scent of blood that had been spilled across the meadow. Ghost inhaled deeply, processing the information that his senses provided. Most of that blood belonged to the mare, a testament to the damage his pack had inflicted before their deaths. She was weakening with every passing moment, her life force draining from the multiple wounds that decorated her body. All he needed to do was wait, to let time and blood loss do what his wolves could not. But patience was a luxury that the burning hatred in his chest would not allow. Tempest could feel her heartbeat slowing, each pump requiring more effort than the last. Her body was beginning to shut down non-essential functions, conserving what remained of her energy for the vital organs that kept her alive. She knew, with the certainty of a creature intimately familiar with death, that she was dying. The wounds were too numerous, the blood loss too severe. Even if the wolf left right now, she might not survive long enough to see another sunrise, but dying later meant nothing if her foals died now. She would hold on until they were safe, and not a moment less. Ghost began to circle again, but this time his movements were different. There was no tactical positioning, no coordinated strategy with packmates who no longer existed. This was a solitary predator assessing a wounded prey, looking for the angle of attack that would minimize his own risk while maximizing his chance of success. He noticed how the mare favored her right side, how her left foreleg barely touched the ground when she shifted her weight. That was his target. The vulnerability he would exploit. The foals had fallen silent behind their mother, their young minds overwhelmed by the sustained terror of the morning. Storm had positioned himself at the front of the group, his small body trembling but his stance defiant. Even at his young age, he understood that something precious was about to be decided, and some part of him wanted to contribute to the fight. Ember pressed close against her brother, drawing comfort from his presence, while offering her own in return. Thunder had curled into a ball on the ground. His eyes closed, his mind retreating to somewhere safer than this blood-soaked meadow. Tempest watched Ghost circle, and he knew that her time was running short. If she waited for him to attack, she would be reacting to his initiative, always one step behind. Her only chance was to seize control of the confrontation, to dictate the terms of this final engagement. It was a gamble that could easily backfire. Charging a wolf in her condition was likely suicide, but waiting for him to pick her apart piece by piece was certain death. and certain death did not protect her children. She gathered the last of her strength, compressing it into a single explosive moment of action. Ghost saw her muscles tense and braced himself for the charge he knew was coming. But Tempest did not charge directly at him. Instead, she lunged to the left, feinting toward his flank before pivoting with surprising speed. The maneuver caught Ghost off guard, forcing him to adjust his position at the last second. It was exactly what Tempest had hoped for. Her rear hooves lashed out with everything she had remaining, a final, thunderous kick that carried the full weight of her desperation. Ghost tried to dodge, but his own adjustment had left him off balance. The hooves caught him across the shoulder and neck, the impact spinning him through the air like a discarded toy. He landed hard, the breath driven from his lungs, his vision swimming with stars and shadows. Tempest pressed her advantage, limping toward the fallen wolf with murder in her eyes. She would not make the mistake of leaving him alive to threaten her foals again. Her front hooves rose above Ghost's prone form, ready to deliver the crushing blow that would end his life. The alpha wolf looked up at the mountain of death descending upon him, and for the first time since he was a pup, he felt the cold grip of true fear. But Tempest's injured leg chose that moment to finally give out. The limb buckled beneath her weight, sending her crashing to the ground just feet from where Ghost lay. The impact drove the air from her own lungs, and for a terrifying moment, she could not breathe, could not move, could not do anything but lie there. As the world spun around her, her foals cried out in alarm, their small voices cutting through the fog of pain that threatened to consume her consciousness. Ghost recovered before she did. The old wolf pushed himself to his feet, his movements slow and pained, but still functional. He looked at the mare struggling to rise, at the foals huddled together without protection, and something changed in his amber eyes. The hatred was still there, burning bright and hot. But it was joined by something else, something that might have been respect, or perhaps simply recognition. This mare had fought with a ferocity that he had never witnessed in prey. She had destroyed his pack, killed his mate, and nearly killed him twice. She had earned something that he had never given to any creature before. Tempest finally managed to lift her head, her vision clearing enough to see the wolf standing over her. She expected to see triumph in his eyes, the gleaming satisfaction of a predator about to claim his prize. But what she saw instead confused her. Ghost was looking at her with an expression that she could not interpret. His head tilted slightly as though considering something that defied his natural instincts. The moment stretched between them, predator and prey, locked in a silent communication that transcended species. Ghost could kill her now, could finish what his pack had started, and feast on her foals while she watched helplessly. The opportunity was there, laid out before him like a gift from the wilderness itself. All he had to do was take it. But he did not take it. Instead, the old alpha wolf did something that he had never done in his entire life. He turned away from easy prey. He turned away from the meal that had cost him everything. He walked toward the tree line, his movements slow and dignified, never looking back at the mare and foals he was leaving behind. The battle was over, and somehow, impossibly, Tempest had won. She watched him disappear into the shadows of the forest, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Then exhaustion claimed her, and the world faded to black. The sun had begun its descent toward the western mountains when Tempest's eyes finally fluttered open. The world came back to her in fragments, pieces of consciousness that slowly assembled into coherent awareness. The first thing she noticed was the warmth pressed against her body, small forms that radiated heat and life against her cooling skin. Her foals had curled up beside her, their bodies arranged in a protective cluster, as though they could shield her from further harm. The sight of them, alive and unharmed, sent a wave of relief through her battered body that was more powerful than any medicine. Storm was the first to notice that his mother had awakened. The young foal lifted his head, his eyes bright with a mixture of hope and lingering fear. He nudged Tempest's cheek with his soft muzzle, a gesture of encouragement that begged her to rise, to stand, to be the invincible protector he had always known. Ember followed her brother's lead, adding her own gentle touches to their mother's face. Even Thunder, who had been so traumatized by the morning's events, crawled closer to press his small body against Tempest's neck. Tempest knew she needed to move, to get herself and her foals away from this place of death and blood. The wolves might return, drawn by the scent of the carnage that surrounded them, or other predators might come, attracted by the opportunity that her weakness presented. But when she tried to rise, her body refused to cooperate. The injuries she had sustained were severe, and the blood loss had left her dangerously weak. Every attempt to stand sent waves of agony through her limbs and forced her back to the ground. The meadow had transformed into a charnel house, the beautiful grass now stained with the evidence of the brutal battle that had taken place. 5 wolf bodies lay scattered across the clearing, their forms already beginning to attract the attention of circling ravens overhead. The scent of death hung heavy in the air, a reminder of the price that had been paid for the foal's survival. Tempest had killed 5 wolves in defense of her children, a feat that would have seemed impossible just hours ago. But victory meant nothing if she could not get her family to safety. Storm seemed to understand his mother's predicament. The young foal stepped back and surveyed the surrounding area with eyes that held a wisdom beyond his months. He had watched his mother fight with the ferocity of a storm-given flesh, had seen her refuse to surrender even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Now it was his turn to be brave, to help in whatever way his small body could manage. He walked to Tempest's head and began to nuzzle her encouragingly, making soft sounds that urged her to try again. Ember joined her brother, positioning herself on Tempest's other side. Together, the twin foals created a support structure of sorts, their small bodies pressed against their mother's neck and shoulders. It was not much, barely any physical assistance at all, but the emotional support was invaluable. Tempest felt their love flowing into her, felt their desperate need for her to survive, giving her strength that her body could not provide on its own. With a tremendous effort that drew a groan of pain from deep within her chest, Tempest pushed herself up onto her front legs. The injured foreleg screamed in protest, but she gritted her teeth and forced it to bear weight. Her rear legs followed, trembling violently but managing to straighten beneath her. For a long moment, she simply stood there, swaying like a tree in a strong wind, fighting to maintain her balance against the dizziness that threatened to send her crashing back to the earth. Thunder watched his mother rise with wide, wondering eyes. The shock that had paralyzed him throughout the battle began to recede, replaced by a tentative hope that perhaps the nightmare was finally ending. He scrambled to his feet and pressed himself against Tempest's rear leg, his small body seeking the comfort of contact. The scratch on his flank had scabbed over, a minor wound that would heal quickly and leave no lasting damage. He was alive because his mother had refused to let him die. Tempest took a cautious step forward, testing her injured legs against the demands of movement. The pain was excruciating, a constant companion that would not be ignored. But pain could be endured, could be pushed aside when necessity demanded. She took another step, then another, each one a small victory against the limitations of her wounded body. Her foals followed close beside her, matching their pace to her slow, labored progress. The journey away from the meadow was measured in yards rather than miles, but to Tempest, it felt like crossing an ocean. Every step required concentration, every movement a battle against the exhaustion that pulled at her consciousness. She led her foals toward a dense stand of trees on the eastern edge of the clearing, seeking the shelter and concealment that the forest could provide. The open meadow had nearly been their grave. She would not make the mistake of remaining exposed again. By the time they reached the tree line, the sun had sunk below the peaks, and twilight was settling over the land. Tempest guided her foals into a small clearing surrounded by thick brush, a natural fortress that would hide them from casual observation. She could go no further. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto a bed of fallen leaves, her body finally surrendering to the demands it had been ignoring for hours. Storm, ember, and thunder immediately clustered around their mother, their small bodies forming a living blanket against the evening chill. They did not understand the full extent of her injuries, did not comprehend how close they had come to losing her forever. All they knew was that she was here, she was warm, and she had kept them safe through the most terrifying experience of their young lives. That knowledge was enough to quiet their fears as darkness settled over the forest. Tempest lay still, conserving what little energy remained in her depleted reserves. The night would be cold, and her wounded body would struggle to maintain its temperature. But her foals were pressed against her, sharing their warmth, and somewhere in the darkness, the wolf who had taken everything from her was walking away with nothing. She had won. Against all odds, against an enemy that should have overwhelmed her, she had won. The night passed in a blur of pain and fitful sleep for Tempest. Her body fought to heal itself, drawing upon reserves that barely existed to close wounds and fight infection. Fever came and went in waves, burning through her system as her immune response struggled against the bacteria that had entered through her many injuries. In her moments of consciousness, she could feel her foals pressed against her, their small hearts beating in rhythm with her own. That connection kept her anchored to life when the darkness beckoned with promises of peaceful oblivion. Dawn arrived slowly, painting the forest canopy in shades of rose and gold. Storm was the first to wake, lifting his head to survey their surroundings with the alertness of a creature who had learned that danger could come without warning. The forest was quiet, populated only by the songs of birds greeting the new day and the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. No wolves prowled the perimeter, no predators lurked in the shadows. For now, they were safe. Tempest opened her eyes as the morning light filtered through the leaves above. Her body felt strange, disconnected from her mind in a way that she had never experienced before. The fever had broken during the night, leaving her weak but clear-headed. She attempted to move and found that, while painful, her limbs responded better than they had the previous evening. The sleep had helped, allowing her body to begin the long process of recovery that would take weeks to complete. Ember stirred beside her mother, her golden coat catching the morning light in a way that made her appear almost ethereal. The young filly had stayed awake through much of the night, watching over Tempest with a vigilance that belied her youth. She had not understood what was happening when her mother's body burned with fever, had not known that the trembling and sweating were signs of a life fighting against death. But she had stayed close, offering her presence as the only medicine she could provide. Thunder remained asleep, his small body curled into a tight ball against Tempest's belly. The youngest foal had retreated into slumber as an escape from the trauma he had experienced, his mind seeking refuge in dreams from a reality too harsh to process. The scratch on his flank had begun to heal cleanly, the scab forming a protective barrier over the damaged tissue. Physically, he would recover quickly. The emotional scars might take considerably longer to fade. Tempest forced herself to stand, knowing that remaining stationary for too long would allow her muscles to stiffen and her wounds to become more problematic. The process was agonizing, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through her battered body. But she had endured worse the previous day and survived. This was merely the aftermath, the price of victory that had to be paid in continued suffering. Her foals rose with her, their movements hesitant and uncertain. They looked to their mother for guidance, for some indication of what came next. Tempest surveyed the small clearing that had sheltered them through the night, and he knew that they could not remain here indefinitely. Food and water were necessities that this location could not provide, and her body desperately needed both to fuel its recovery. They would have to move to find a place where survival was possible. The journey began slowly, Tempest leading her foals through the forest with careful steps. She chose a path that followed the sound of running water, her instincts guiding her toward the stream that wound through the valley below. Every few minutes she would stop to rest, her legs trembling from the exertion of simple movement. Storm and Ember stayed close beside her, while Thunder trailed slightly behind, his young eyes scanning the forest for threats that might emerge from the shadows. They reached the stream by mid-morning, the sight of clear water sparkling in the sunlight, filling Tempest with profound relief. She waded into the shallows on unsteady legs, lowering her head to drink deeply of the cold, clean liquid. The water seemed to flow through her entire body, replenishing what the blood loss had taken, awakening cells that had begun to shut down from dehydration. Her foals joined her, splashing in the stream with something approaching their normal playfulness. The bank of the stream was lined with soft grass, the kind of tender growth that provided excellent nutrition for recovering animals. Tempest began to graze slowly, her teeth pulling up mouthfuls of green sustenance that her body converted into desperately needed energy. The process was automatic, requiring no conscious thought, allowing her mind to wander while her body focused on the essential task of feeding itself. She thought about the wolves, about the battle that had nearly claimed her life and the lives of her children. The memory was still raw, still capable of triggering the racing heart and tense muscles of fear response. But there was something else mixed with the fear now, something that might have been pride. She had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious. She had protected her foals against an enemy that should have overwhelmed her. Whatever happened from this point forward, that achievement could never be taken away. Storm grazed beside his mother, his young body requiring fuel to continue its rapid growth. The events of the previous day had changed him in ways that would only become apparent over time. He had witnessed his mother's ferocity, had seen what she was capable of when her children were threatened. That lesson would shape his own character, teaching him that courage was not the absence of fear, but the determination to act despite it. Ember stayed close to Thunder, her sisterly instincts driving her to protect the youngest member of their family. She had noticed how withdrawn he had become, how the spark of curiosity that normally animated his young face had dimmed. She did not understand psychology or trauma, but she understood that her brother needed comfort. So she provided it, pressing against him whenever he seemed to drift too far away, reminding him that he was not alone. The sun climbed higher, warming the air and drying the dew from the grass. Tempest continued to graze, feeling her strength slowly returning with each passing hour. The wounds on her body still throbbed with pain, but the bleeding had stopped completely, and the edges of the torn flesh were beginning to knit together. She would carry scars from this battle for the rest of her life, permanent reminders etched into her hide of the day she had faced death, and refused to surrender. 3 days passed by the stream, each one bringing incremental improvements to Tempest's condition. The wounds that had seemed so grievous began to close properly, the flesh knitting together with the remarkable healing ability that horses possessed. Her appetite returned with a vengeance, driving her to graze for hours at a time as her body demanded the fuel necessary for recovery. The fever did not return, a sign that infection had been avoided despite the dirty conditions of the battle. Against all medical probability, she was going to survive. Her foals adapted to the new routine with the resilience that youth provided. Storm had appointed himself as the family's sentinel, positioning himself at the highest point of the stream bank to watch for approaching danger. He took his self-assigned duty seriously, his young eyes scanning the tree line with an intensity that would have been comical under different circumstances. Ember divided her time between grazing and caring for Thunder, whose recovery from the psychological trauma was proving slower than anyone had hoped. Thunder had begun to eat again, which was encouraging, but his movements remained hesitant, and his eyes held a haunted quality that broke Tempest's heart. The youngest foal startled at every sound, flinching away from shadows and unexpected movements. At night, he pressed so tightly against his mother that she could feel his small heart racing with nameless fears. The wolves had taken something from him that might never fully return, an innocence that could not be restored, once shattered. On the fourth morning, Tempest felt strong enough to consider leaving their temporary sanctuary. The stream had provided everything they needed for recovery, but it was not a permanent home. The meadow where she had traditionally grazed with other wild horses lay several miles to the north, a journey that would test her healing body but was necessary for their long-term survival. There was safety in numbers, and rejoining the herd would provide protection that she could not offer alone in her weakened state. The journey north began under clear skies, the autumn sun providing warmth without the oppressive heat of summer. Tempest set a slow pace, listening to her body, and stopping whenever the pain became too intense. Her foals walked beside her in a tight formation, Storm on the left, Ember on the right, and Thunder tucked safely between them. They moved as a unit, a small family bound together by love and shared trauma. The landscape changed gradually as they traveled, the dense forest giving way to rolling hills dotted with stands of aspen and pine. Tempest recognized landmarks from her previous journeys through this territory, using them to navigate toward the meadow where the herd would be grazing. Each familiar sight brought a measure of comfort, a reminder that the world beyond the nightmare of the wolf attack still existed unchanged. By midday, they crested a hill that overlooked the valley where the wild horses gathered. Tempest stopped at the summit, her eyes taking in the sight that spread before her. Dozens of horses dotted the meadow below, their coats gleaming in various shades of brown, black, and white. Foals played near their mothers while stallions stood guard at the perimeter. It was a scene of peaceful normalcy, a stark contrast to the violence that had defined the past week. Storm let out an excited whinny at the sight of other horses, his young voice carrying across the valley. Several heads lifted in response, ears swiveling toward the sound. A gray mare that Tempest recognized as an old friend began making her way up the hill, her curiosity evident in her purposeful stride. Behind her, other members of the herd followed, drawn by the prospect of newcomers joining their ranks. The gray mare, whose name was Willow, reached them first. Her nostrils flared as she processed the scents that clung to Tempest's coat, the dried blood and the lingering traces of wolf. Her eyes widened as she took in the healing wounds that covered her friend's body, the evidence of a battle that defied comprehension. She circled Tempest slowly, cataloging the injuries with growing amazement. "What happened to you?" her body language seemed to ask. "What could have done this and left you still standing?" Tempest did not have the means to answer in words, but her bearing spoke volumes. She stood tall despite her wounds, her head held high with the dignity of a warrior who had faced death and emerged victorious. Her foals clustered around her, healthy and whole, the ultimate proof that whatever had attacked them had failed in its mission. The story was written in scars and survival, a narrative that needed no verbal translation. Other horses arrived, forming a loose circle around Tempest and her family. They touched noses with her foals, welcoming the youngsters into the herd with gentle sniffs and soft sounds. Storm puffed up with pride at the attention, while Ember accepted the greetings with quiet grace. Even Thunder seemed to relax slightly in the presence of so many other horses, the safety of the herd penetrating his shell of fear. A large bay stallion pushed through the gathered horses, his dominant position in the herd evident in the way others moved aside for him. His name was Titan, and he had been the undisputed leader of this band for 5 seasons. He approached Tempest with a mixture of authority and respect, his intelligent eyes assessing her condition with careful attention. What he saw impressed him, though his stoic expression revealed little of his thoughts. Titan circled Tempest as Willow had done, but his examination was more thorough, more searching. He noted the defensive wounds on her front legs, the bite marks on her flanks, the healing gash on her neck. Each injury told part of a story, and Titan was experienced enough to read them accurately. This mare had fought multiple attackers, had sustained tremendous damage, and had still managed to protect her young. Such courage deserved recognition. The stallion stopped in front of Tempest and lowered his head, a gesture of respect that he rarely offered to any horse. Tempest returned the gesture, acknowledging his position while accepting his acknowledgement of her achievement. An understanding passed between them, unspoken but profound. She and her foals were welcome here, protected by the herd's collective strength. They had found their way home. The weeks that followed brought healing to both body and spirit. Tempest's wounds closed completely, leaving behind a network of scars that would mark her forever as a survivor. The most prominent scar ran along her neck, where Ghost's teeth had nearly found their fatal mark. A pale line against her chestnut coat that served as a permanent reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. She wore her scars with pride, badges of honor earned in the most desperate battle a mother could ever face. The herd accepted Tempest and her foals completely, integrating them into the complex social structure that governed wild horse society. Willow became a constant companion, grazing beside Tempest during the day and standing watch nearby during the night. The gray mare had no foals of her own that season, and she seemed to have adopted Storm, Ember, and Thunder as surrogate children, showering them with attention and protection that supplemented their mother's care. Storm flourished in the herd environment, his natural leadership qualities emerging as he interacted with other foals his age. The experience with the wolves had hardened him in ways that set him apart from his peers, giving him a seriousness and watchfulness that the others lacked. He organized the young horses into games that were really training exercises, teaching them to respond to threats and work together as a unit. The other mothers noticed and approved, recognizing that Storm's lessons might one day save their children's lives. Ember grew into a beautiful young filly, her golden coat deepening to a rich amber that caught the light like liquid fire. She had inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's grace, combining them into a presence that drew admiring glances from horses throughout the herd. But her true gift was empathy, an ability to sense the emotional states of those around her and respond with appropriate comfort. She became the unofficial healer of young hearts, sought out by foals who were frightened or sad. Thunder's recovery was the slowest, but ultimately the most remarkable. The youngest foal had retreated so deeply into himself that some wondered if he would ever fully return, but Ember refused to give up on her brother, spending countless hours beside of him, coaxing him back to engagement with the world one small step at a time. Gradually, the light returned to his eyes. The flinching decreased, the nightmares faded, and the curious, playful colt that had existed before the attack began to re-emerge. By the time winter arrived, painting the mountains white and driving the herd to lower pastures, Thunder had transformed completely. He ran and played with the other foals, his laughter ringing across the meadows like bells. The scratch on his flank had healed into a small scar, barely visible beneath his growing winter coat. He still stayed close to his mother, but now it was from love rather than fear. The wolves had not broken him after all. They had only delayed his blossoming. Tempest watched her children grow with a contentment that she had never expected to feel again. The terror of that autumn morning had faded into memory, still vivid but no longer paralyzing. She had learned something about herself during that battle, discovered reserves of strength and courage that she had not known existed. The knowledge changed her, made her more confident in her ability to protect her family against whatever challenges the future might bring. Sometimes, late at night when the herd was sleeping, Tempest would think about Ghost. The old alpha wolf had spared her life when he could have easily taken it, walking away from a victory that was within his grasp. She would never understand why he had made that choice, what had passed through his mind in that moment of decision. Perhaps he had recognized something in her, a kinship between predator and protector that transcended the boundaries of species. Perhaps he had simply been too wounded to continue. She would never know for certain. The story of Tempest's battle spread throughout the region, carried by observers who had witnessed the aftermath and pieced together what had happened. Rangers found the wolf bodies in the meadow, counted them, and marveled at the evidence of combat written in the trampled grass. 5 wolves killed by a single mare defending her foals. It seemed impossible, yet the proof lay before them. The tale became legend, told around campfires and in wildlife documentaries, an example of maternal courage that inspired all who heard it. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, melting the snow and carpeting the meadows with wildflowers. Tempest led her now yearling foals through the same valley where they had nearly died, her head held high as she walked past the site of the battle. The grass had grown over the bloodstains, nature erasing the evidence of violence with new life. But the memories remained, embedded in the land itself, whispering of sacrifice and survival to any who cared to listen. Storm, Ember, and Thunder paused at the meadow's edge, something in their young minds recognizing the significance of this place. They stood beside their mother in silence, a moment of remembrance for the battle that had shaped their lives. Then Storm raised his head and let out a call that echoed off the mountains, a sound of triumph and defiance that announced to the world that they were still here, still alive, still unbroken. Tempest added her voice to her son's, a deeper note that harmonized with his youthful cry. Ember and Thunder joined in, creating a chorus that rang across the valley like a hymn to survival. The sound reached the forest where Ghost had disappeared so many months ago, carrying a message that needed no translation. We are still standing. We will always stand. No matter what comes for us, we will face it together, and we will prevail. The echoes faded into silence, absorbed by the mountains that had witnessed so much over countless centuries. Tempest turned and led her family toward the herd that waited in the distance, toward the life that continued despite all odds. Behind them, the meadow returned to its peaceful state, just another beautiful clearing in the Montana wilderness. But for those who knew its history, it would forever be a sacred place, a monument to the fierce and unconditional love of a mother who refused to let anything take her children away.